All right, so today we're diving into Sherman's March to the Sea.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's gonna be a tough one, I think. This is one of those moments in history that you
Yeah.
really got to kind of wrestle with.
Yeah.
And we're looking at an episode of American History Tellers called March to the Sea.
It's one that's definitely stuck with me.
Yeah, so to set the stage right, we're talking 1864. Civil War's been raging for years.
Yeah.
Lincoln's facing re-election, and things aren't looking so hot for him politically.
Not at all. The North desperately needs a victory.
Yeah, they need something to turn the tide.
Hmm.
But how do you win? A war that's already claimed so many lives and divided a nation.
Right. And you have these two very different approaches happening at the same time. You've got
Yeah.
Grant just grinding it out in Virginia with the Overland Campaign, brutal fighting high casualties.
Yeah.
And then you have Sherman down in Georgia maneuvering, trying to outflank the Confederates.
So Atlanta falls to Sherman's forces. It's a huge victory for the Union. Yeah. But the way that it's presented, Sherman sends a telegram to Lincoln calling it a Christmas gift.
It's chilling.
Yeah. You have this image of relief in the North,
Yeah.
jubilation,
Yeah.
right? A much needed boost for Lincoln,
Yeah.
the war effort. But Atlanta's in ruins. Civilians are displaced.
Yeah.
And you start to get the sense of unease. Like, how far is Sherman willing to go?
And this is where we start to see like that hard war philosophy in action.
Right.
Destroying military targets, that's one thing. But Sherman's going after infrastructure crops. Anything that could support the Confederacy. It feels very personal.
It's definitely a departure from the traditional rules of war. I mean,
Yeah.
at this point, targeting civilian resources was considered
Yeah.
radical, barbaric to some.
So what was Sherman thinking? I mean, was he just ruthless or is there some logic behind this?
Well, Sherman believed that to truly win the war, you had to completely break the South's will to fight.
Okay.
He argued that by targeting their resources and disrupting their entire way of life, he could shorten the war, ultimately save lives. That makes sense. But it still seems so risky, right? Cutting yourself off from your supply lines, relying on foraging. That just sounds like a disaster waiting to happen.
He knew that. He acknowledged the potential for things to get out of control. He even publicly criticized some of the looting, the destruction carried out by his troops.
Yeah.
The infamous bummers, as they were called. But there was this understanding that a certain level of ruthlessness was necessary to achieve his objectives.
So the podcast talks about this encounter between Sherman and a soldier from the 112th Massachusetts who's out foraging. And I thought that was such a fascinating little detail. It gives you this glimpse into like the everyday reality of the march.
Yeah, this soldier stumbles upon Sherman himself, who's inspecting a recently acquired supply of sweet potatoes.
Oh, wow.
And it just really speaks volumes about the conditions on the ground. Here's the commanding general, not in some grand headquarters, but right there with his men concerned about feeding them.
It kind of humanizes him in a way. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And it's interesting how the soldier reacts to seeing him.
Yeah. What was his reaction? I mean, this is the guy waging war on his homeland.
There's no anger or hatred. It's more like awe and curiosity. He sees Sherman not as a monster, but as a man driven by a purpose, even if that purpose is controversial.
And that's what makes this whole thing so complicated,
Yeah.
right? There are no easy answers. There's no clear cut. Good guys and bad guys. It's just Sherman, this brilliant but flawed figure, trying to end a war that's tearing the nation apart. And in the process, he unleashes this level of destruction that's just hard to fathom.
Right. We're talking wrecked infrastructure, miles of railroad tracks twisted into those iconic Sherman neckties, farmlands just stripped bare.
Yeah, it's just hard to imagine the terror that people must have felt seeing this army marching through their towns and villages, taking what they need, leaving destruction in their wake.
And it wasn't just about material losses. Sherman's march tore apart the fabric of Southern society. Families were divided, community shattered.
Yeah.
It created this pervasive sense of fear and uncertainty.
But amidst all of this destruction, there's another narrative unfolding, right?
Yeah.
The experience of enslaved people encountering Sherman's army must have been completely different.
Absolutely. For many enslaved people, Sherman's arrival was seen as a liberation, a chance to escape the bonds of slavery.
Right.
They flocked to his army, seeking protection, a path to freedom.
So it's this incredible juxtaposition. Destruction and liberation happening simultaneously.
Yeah.
It's just such a stark reminder that war is never a simple equation, and the impact on different groups can be vastly different.
It raises all sorts of questions about the legacy of Sherman's march. Was it a necessary evil to end a horrific war? Or was it this brutal act of aggression that left lasting scars on the South?
It's definitely not a simple story, and I think that's what makes it so important to understand. So we set the stage, we've talked about hard war, we've gotten a glimpse of the march itself.
Yeah.
But there's still a lot more to unpack here.
There is. We haven't even touched on the political climate surrounding the 1864 election or the long-term impact of Sherman's march on the South.
Right. Well, we've got a whole episode to dive into all of that, so let's take a quick break and then we'll get back to it.
While Sherman was marching through Georgia, things weren't exactly peaceful up north either. The 1864 election was...
Oh, right. Lincoln was running for a second term?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. I bet that was pretty tense with the war dragging on. People probably getting fed up.
The nation was deeply divided. The Republicans, the National Union Party, as they were calling themselves, they were all about continuing the war until the Union was restored. No compromises.
And what about the Democrats? Where did they stand on the war at this point?
Well, you had the War Democrats, and despite their name, they were actually starting to lean toward peace negotiations.
Okay.
They wanted to find a way to end the bloodshed, bring the southern states back into the fold.
So not pro-South, but not exactly thrilled about continuing the war either. Makes sense. What about the rest of the Democrats? I feel like some of them were pretty outspoken against the war.
Exactly. You had the hardcore peace Democrats, the Copperheads, who wanted to end the war immediately no matter what. They saw it as a failure and believed that the South had a right to secede.
Wow, so like a pretty wide range of opinions within one party. That must have made things interesting for their candidate.
Oh, absolutely. And their candidate was none other than General George McClellan.
Oh, McClellan. The guy Lincoln fired.
Right. And his stance on the war was, let's just say it was a delicate balancing act.
I bet. He wasn't exactly campaigning on, let's keep fighting this war, was he?
He was trying to appeal to both sides of the party, be seen as the peer candidate, the guy who could bring everyone together, end the war. But at the same time, he didn't want to alienate the War Democrats, so he ended up walking this incredibly fine line.
Yeah, that never really works out, does it?
It did not. And then, right in the middle of all this political chaos, Sherman captures Atlanta. Huge turning point. Not just militarily, but politically as well.
I bet Lincoln's chances of re-election must have looked a lot better after that. Nothing unites a country like a good victory.
It reshaped the entire political landscape. The Republicans were energized, the Democrats were in disarray, and McClellan was basically forced to choose stick with his peace platform or embrace the victory and risk alienating the Copperheads.
So what did he do? Did he stick to his guns or jump on the victory train?
He tried to have it both ways.
Oh boy.
He praised Sherman's success while still arguing for a negotiated peace.
I can only imagine how that went over. The Copperheads must have been furious.
They were. It fractured the Democratic Party even further, making it nearly impossible to present a united front against Lincoln.
Advantage Lincoln. But even with all this good news, the war wasn't over yet, right?
No. The Confederacy was still fighting, but the capture of Atlanta, along with other Union victories like the capture of Mobile Bay, gave the North something to celebrate.
Yeah.
Renewed their faith in Lincoln's leadership and their belief that the Union could be preserved.
So you had this really interesting interplay between the military campaign and the political situation back home. It's like these two different battles happening at the same time, each one influencing the other.
Absolutely. And as Sherman continues his march through Georgia, the stakes just get higher and higher. He's not just fighting the Confederate Army, he's trying to break the spirit of the South itself.
This is where that hard war strategy really comes into focus.
Right.
It's not just about defeating armies. It's about targeting the very fabric of Southern society, its ability to function, its ability to sustain the war effort.
Exactly. Sherman understood that logistics and morale were just as crucial as battles on the field. He wanted to disrupt everything: infrastructure, food supplies, transportation, the sense of normalcy that people were clinging to.
And that wasn't just some abstract strategy. It translated into real actions that had a devastating impact on people's lives.
Right. His army living off the land became this unstoppable force, taking what they needed, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake.
Yeah, the podcast really drives home the extent of the destruction, talking about those infamous bummers. Those foraging parties, they've almost become a caricature, a symbol of unchecked looting and brutality.
Right.
What was their actual role in the campaign?
Well, the primary purpose was to gather supplies, food, livestock, anything that could keep the army moving. But there's no denying that there were excesses. Incidents of loot and vandalism, even violence against civilians.
So it wasn't a clean operation. There was a human costing of a dark side to it, even if it was deemed necessary.
Absolutely. And Sherman himself wrestled with this moral dilemma. He condemned the worst offenses, but he also understood that a certain level of ruthlessness was inevitable in the context of total war.
It's that complicated mix of brilliance, pragmatism, and brutality
Yeah.
that makes Sherman such a controversial figure.
And we can't forget the impact on the enslaved people. While white Southerners saw Sherman's army as a force of destruction, many black Southerners saw them as liberators. They joined his ranks, seeking freedom, a chance to build a new life.
So you have this stark contrast, destruction and liberation happening side by side. It's a reminder that history is rarely black and white. Every event has multiple layers, multiple perspectives.
It's important to acknowledge both the positive and negative consequences of Sherman's actions. He played a crucial role in ending the war and ending slavery, but he also inflicted immense suffering, leaving scars that would take generations to heal.
And all of this happening against the backdrop of this incredibly contentious election. It's mind-boggling to think about all these different forces at play.
It really is. And as Sherman's march continues, he's about to enter a new phase one that will take him to the very heart of the Confederacy, South Carolina.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about the political climate, the strategy behind hard war, and the impact of the march on both white and black Southerners.
And we've only scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore about the legacy of Sherman's march and its place in the story of the Civil War.
South Carolina, huh? The birthplace of secession. It feels like things are coming to a head.
It was definitely a symbolic target. You know, South Carolina was the first state to leave the Union, the flashpoint of the whole conflict. For Sherman's troops, this wasn't just another military objective. It was a chance to strike at the heart of the rebellion.
And what about the Confederacy? Were they ready to give up, or were they still holding on?
Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, was still defiant, issuing pronouncements, urging the people to fight on. But you could hear the desperation in his voice. The resources were dwindling, the manpower depleted, and the defeats were piling up.
What about Lee? He was facing Grant in Virginia, right?
Yeah, Lee's army was battered, exhausted. They'd been fighting for months, repelling Grant's attacks, but the toll was heavy. His lines were stretched, thin supplies low, and the pressure was mounting.
So you have Sherman marching towards South Carolina, Lee, struggling to hold on in Virginia, and the Confederate leadership clinging to hope that was fading fast. It sounds like the end was near.
The momentum had definitely shifted. The capture of Atlanta had really energized the North and demoralized the South. And with Sherman's continued success, it seemed like it was only a matter of time.
But knowing Sherman and his hard war strategy, I'm guessing South Carolina wasn't in for an easy time.
Unfortunately, you're right. Sherman's march through South Carolina was even more destructive than Georgia.
Really?
Some historians believe there was an element of retribution involved, you know, a desire to punish the state that started it all.
Wow, that's intense. It's a reminder that war isn't just about strategy and tactics. It's about emotions. Anger, revenge.
Exactly. And those emotions can lead to actions that are hard to justify, even in war.
Yeah.
Sherman's march through South Carolina left a trail of devastation that took generations to overcome.
So we followed Sherman from Atlanta to Savannah and now into South Carolina. It's been a journey marked by military brilliance, but also brutal destruction. As we wrap up our deep dive into this event, what are the key takeaways here?
I think the most important thing is to recognize the complexity of Sherman's march. The way it embodies both the triumphs and the tragedies of war.
Right.
It was a military campaign that helped end slavery and preserve the Union, but it came at a tremendous cost, both in terms of human life and the scars left on the South.
It's not a simple story. It forces us to think about the moral dilemmas of war, the choices leaders have to make, and the consequences of those choices for individuals and entire communities.
It also reminds us that history isn't just facts and dates. It's about people's stories. The experiences of those who lived through these events, both the victors and the vanquished.
That's a really important point. You know, it's easy to get caught up in the big battles, the famous generals. But we have to remember that behind every historical event, there are countless stories of courage, suffering, resilience, and loss.
Absolutely. And as you continue to explore history, I encourage you to seek out those stories, dig deeper, challenge the narratives, and consider the different perspectives.
Well said. So to wrap things up, we'll leave you with this. How do we reconcile the brutality of war with the pursuit of noble goals? How do we learn from the past and build a better future? These are questions that we're still wrestling with today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.